If I had to make a list of the historic races that were astonishing, this one would be at the top.
It's a very fine line between being competitive, trying to win, and just maybe trying not to get into too much trouble.
I think all three of us could have won it.
If you speak to most drivers, even though we have these lengthy briefings before each race, very few of us know the rules properly.
Robert looked as though he had an impossible mountain to climb. It's 20 years ago plus, but I certainly remember it because I've commentated on hundreds, maybe thousands of races over the last however many years, but there are always a few that stand out.
Welcome to Goodwood. Once in every lifetime, something so magical happens to you that you have to pinch yourself to believe it's true.
I think it was a sort of culture shock to a lot of the younger drivers because they hadn't been to Goodwood before. And the way Goodwood had been recreated, Goodwood Circuit had been restored back to all the photographs that we'd seen of the racing going on there in the 40s and 50s. I think it was a bit of a shock to them.
Well, of course, it was really exciting for most of us, especially the old-timers like myself who'd grown up with proper circuits without runoff areas and lots of Armco, so to me it was just great.
Goodwood had always held this image of being, you know, the sort of mecca of sports car and single-seater and every kind of racing of the 50s and 60s. And that was the key period, or that is the key period in historic racing. That's where all the action is. So when Charles said that he was going to bring racing back to the circuit, everybody was absolutely full of beans about that. It was really exciting.
Maybe they were a bit blasé, but they were used to racing their historic cars on modern circuits with modern backdrops, with modern barriers. And the extraordinary thing about Goodwood was that the track, but also the scenery, the backdrop, was so period that you couldn't help but be impressed.
I was racing the Lotus 15, which then belonged to the Dutch National Motor Museum, the Laumann collection. And it's a privateer car, a little 2-litre car from 1959, which was originally bought by a chap called Dougie Graham. And he entered as a privateer, and it ran here at Goodwood in the 50s and early 60s. And was very, very original, had been hardly messed about with at all.
Certainly with the Lister, with its Chevrolet engine, that really was an interesting car. And I learnt very quickly, the owner of the car, my dear friend Bobby Bowell, when we first tested it at Silverstone, soon after he bought it, and he did a few laps, came into the pits and said, "This thing's trying to kill me, you better drive it." So I thought, oh, thank you very much. So when I got in it, I thought, yes, I see what he means.
Every car looked absolutely wonderful. There wasn't a remotely scruffy car there. There wasn't a dent anywhere. It wasn't just the racing. The whole event, in an extraordinary way, had gone back half a century, and that was magical.
The cars were an interesting mix, with an interesting mix of very experienced drivers. So of course you're pretty guaranteed to get a bit of fun.
I sort of had a good idea of where the car stood, and it was going to be one of the top 5 or 6 cars, hopefully. But beyond that, I didn't really know. None of us really knew the circuit that well, and this was all absolutely new.
The Lotus, very quick through the corners, very light, very good braking. The Lister Jaguar, much heavier, much more agricultural in its road holding, but much quicker down the straight. And that's what produces these wonderful battles, because the cars are quick in different places.
The Chevrolet engine power delivery was a bit brutal for the chassis, and so it would unsettle it in places you didn't want it to be unsettled. But it was great fun, and really it was all part of the fun. But
historic racing was, even then, and now even more so, pretty serious stuff for the drivers when they're actually racing. And both Frank Sittner in that wonderful big Lister Jaguar and Robert in the Lotus 15 had been racing very regularly. They were out fighting each other many weekends of the year, and there was some history there.
He and Frank used to have a bit of needle going on. I would call it competitive needle, maybe.
I think my main expected problem was going to come from Frank Sittner, because he and I had been dicing, shall we say, most of the season up until then. And I think when Frank lined up on the grid, I'd qualified second, he qualified third on the outside of the front row. When he lined up on the grid only about 3 or 4 feet away from my car, pointing at my car as opposed to pointing up the track, I thought, this is Frank with his touring car hat on. So I guess I anticipated a few issues.
The car in the middle of the front row, number 5, that's Robert Brooks's Lotus 15. Then on the outside with the dark yellow stripe, that's Frank Sittner's Lister Jaguar. Behind, one of the Cooper Monaco, rear-engine Cooper Monaco's, John Harper's car. The green flag at the back says that the grid is all in position. The flag falls, they're away, and Frank Sittner uses all the 300 horsepower of the Lister Jaguar to take the lead. It's Frank Sittner who leads. Robert Brooks is side by side with James Shedd for second place on the outside of Madgwick, and as they all go through Madgwick in a great high-speed traffic jam, it is Frank Sittner who has the lead.
When the race began, Murray and I, looking at the television pictures in our commentary box, didn't actually realise what had happened as the cars left the grid at the very start. But then there was a replay about a lap and a half later, and it was absolutely clear from the overhead shot from the Goodyear air balloon that Frank had just ruthlessly swung right and squeezed Robert into a tiny gap between him and Shedd's Lotus 15. They collided quite heftily, and obviously Robert was enraged by that.
Frank's spinner on the side of the Lister had acted like a Roman chariot, spinning down the side of the Lotus 15, and had snapped the spring clip off the side of the bodywork, which tipped it on. And all of a sudden, all I could see in my mirror was this huge, great aerofoil sitting up at the back.
And look at the bodywork coming off Robert Brooks's car. The bodywork is completely adrift. Is he going to stop? He'll surely come into the pits to have that dealt with. There was some sort of damage, I think, to that car at the beginning. He's not going to stop. He goes storming over the start-finish line. They're going to have to black flag him, surely.
There is no question that whatever Robert's motivation was, it was a wonderful race for everybody that he didn't stop. But I was astonished that he didn't.
This is a problem, and at first, of course, I was quite concerned that this bodywork would fly off, so I'm very conscious of it.
It could have hit him, he could have decapitated him. If you look at a Lotus 15, cars were very flimsy and very fragile in those days. The whole of that rear bodywork was one piece of shaped, thin aluminium.
And the whole of the rear tail of the Lotus 15 is one very solidly mounted piece. And so I knew that it wasn't going anywhere.
I don't think he was being foolhardy. I think he was just getting on with the job, as it were, and to hell with it. If it comes off, it comes off. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But then I thought, well, inevitably he'll get black flagged for this, which is hard luck for him, but good luck for me. And so there was a limit to how much was it really worth taking too many risks, being as he's probably going to have to pull in anyway. Well, of course, after a few laps when nothing was happening, I thought, well, fair enough.
Well, it was a black and orange flag, which is a flag that gets hung out if there's a mechanical issue on a car. And actually the flag went out while we were up at Lavant, right at the top of the circuit.
I think at the time Robert was not quite sure himself, or he pleaded ignorance, put it that way, that he was waiting for the interpretation.
Essentially, if I did see it, I don't remember it.
We were astonished, Murray and I, as lap succeeded lap. A, he wasn't stopping. B, the organisers seemed to have given up trying to make him stop. And C, the bodywork hadn't flown off yet.
Well, the
Because
red
although
mist,
he's doing extremely well where he is, he really ought to come in and get that body fixed.
he is going quicker than anybody else. Despite this air brake on the back of his car, he's caught right up with the leading two Listers.
The chicane is really only one car wide. And if you're going to outbrake a car going into the chicane, there is a point past which you're not going to be able to overtake without an accident. And if you're not going to be able to outbrake the car before you get to that point, you have to hang back. Well, Robert didn't.
Well, I knew as I came into the chicane that John was a quicker car. It seemed apparent to me that if the Lotus 11 was between me and John, it would give me a little bit of breathing space.
Oh, and a big moment in the chicane there because John Harper went straight on.
And I looked in my mirror and John had just gone. And so I had no idea what had happened at all.
Robert left his braking very late, a very good manoeuvre up the inside, but because it was so late, suddenly John Harper had nowhere to go.
I remember the race best of all for an amazing dice with Stuart Graham.
I think it was made a very interesting contrast between the styles of the two cars. He could dive into corners much quicker than me, but you know, I'd got the advantage down the straights. So, but it was great fun.
Stuart is a much better driver than I, but he was in a car which, you know, was very heavy and is a handful around here with that big 5-litre Chevrolet engine. And I just remember having this fabulous motor racing lesson from Stuart as we went round and round the circuit, and every time I looked for a space to get past, he'd close it.
Stuart Graham takes the inside line, but Robert Brooks is not to be stopped. Robert Brooks now has second place. Now, this is going to be interesting because remember, it is no secret. The Chevrolet goes back on the straight, down that long straight. That's where the Chevrolet-powered Lister has all the power. But Robert Brooks is going to fight back again. A fantastic battle between these two.
Literally nose to tail, and there must be barely a coat of paint between each car. Nose to tail, with the car sort of sliding away and the driver's all balancing everything up. And it's almost poetry in motion, and you think, wow, this is amazing, really. It was just unfortunate my car didn't finish the race. We started to see the water temperature getting a bit high, if I recall, and eventually the engine gave out, but you know, by which time Robert had got ahead anyway.
Stuart Graham puts his hand up and I think rolls out of the race.
Clearly, I knew that Frank was well up the road, so I had to get on with it.
Robert's comeback from 5th place was extraordinary. There used to be a measure where you said how quickly were you going, and 8/10 would be you were trying pretty hard. 9/10 you were absolutely flat out. 10/10 you were being foolish and you were probably going to have a big accident. The fact that Robert was angry meant that he was driving probably harder and faster than he'd ever driven in his life.
Frank was the first to come across the traffic. They didn't know he was there. Once he'd gone past, they realised they were being lapped. That makes it a little bit easier for the guy behind. And so they were ready for me when I came past.
Look, he's right up alongside him. This is going to be a change of leader. There is indeed. They've got ahead of them Adrian Hall's Lotus 10 to lap the red car. In fact, Adrian Hall gets well out of the way, and now Frank Sittner's mirrors are full of the Lotus 15 with the flapping bodywork, and Robert Brooks, the one man he wants to beat on this track.
But once I was behind Frank, it was a devil's job to get past.
What was lovely about it was that Frank, himself a very aggressive driver, he was clearly on the defensive. If you're just relying on your rearview mirror and you're on the defensive, then you're on the back foot.
Frank is a much more experienced touring car racer than me, but he is also a touring car racer, so he knows how to hold a line, and it was tough to get past.
Each one was determined to beat the other, and it made for good races. And it's interesting how the race unfolded, that even with Frank, his good handling and well-developed Lister at the time, slowly but surely, you know, he lost speed and the tyres had given out and all the usual sort of things that happen during the course of the race, and allowed the smaller cars to come back at it.
You've got to remember that the Lotus was quicker in the corners, had better brakes, but was nothing like as fast down the straight. And the fact that he was able to get past Frank Sittner by very adroitly using a back marker. You see him come into Latham very wide. He'd seen the back marker. He wanted to make sure that Frank was going to be delayed by the back marker. So he went very wide into that right-hander so that he could chop right on into the inside. And suddenly Frank Sittner found he was there, had a back marker there, and that was really what won Robert the race.
Still Sittner is ahead, but they've got the long double right-hander of Lavant ahead of them. They've got Robbie McKenzie Lowe's little Elva to lap, and look at how wide Sittner it goes as they come out of it, and Brooks is along.
Yes, he's done it!
Brooks is ahead, but now they've got the long straight, and that's where 300 horsepower of Jaguar power will surely tell. Robert Brooks leads.
I cannot
Frank
believe.
Sittner is in second place. Frank Sittner is in the slipstream. Frank Sittner pulls out of the slipstream. They go down towards Woodcote Corner, but Robert Brooks is going to brake very, very late indeed. They come to the corner, and Robert Brooks brakes much later, and Brooks still has the lead as they come through Woodcote. This is the last corner of the last lap. They come into the chicane. Robert Brooks flicks the car understeering slightly. The checkered flag is waiting. He didn't take the black flag. He's now going to take the checkered flag. Robert Brooks wins.
To win it literally almost on the last lap after all that was pretty amazing, really, and I still think it was certainly probably the drive of Robert's racing life at that stage.
I remember very clearly the reaction of the crowd and the mechanics on the pit wall and everything else. I think everybody was into it, and to have that 1-2-3 finish with each of us about half a car's length apart at the end was almost perfection. It's one of those bizarre things, but when I came down to Woodcote on the last lap and went through the corner, it sounds bizarre, but I could hear them shouting and I could see the wavings.
If you're a commentator, you cannot act excitement. You've got to be really excited, because otherwise it's absolutely clear to every viewer that it's manufactured. With Murray, it was never manufactured. He loved it, he felt it, he was genuinely excited. And of course, if you're commentating with him, that excitement is tremendously infectious. Frequently we were talking over each other because neither of us could shut up. When we'd finished and switched our microphones off, I mean, the first thing was that we both kind of goggled to each other saying, wow. And then we said to each other, what's going to happen now? Because if the view of the race stewards is that Robert has disobeyed a flag signal, then they're going to have to penalise him.
From the race point of view, it was a great decision to let him carry on and his to carry on. Had it been something else and the bodywork had flown off and caused all sorts of mayhem, then of course, as usual, people would have all been very wise after the event and said it shouldn't have happened. But the way it panned out, I thought it was fine, and it made a great spectacle. And Goodwood is always about entertaining the spectators and everybody else, and it made a great race, and I think Robert coped with it extremely well. I mean, it does raise some wonderfully interesting technical aerodynamic questions.
I still don't know to this day why Robert got away with it. The crowd were ecstatic, they were on their feet, they were cheering and clapping, and I suppose if there had been some sort of sanction against Robert, it would have spoiled a miraculous occasion.
For years we've always still talked about it, and Robert reminds me, of course, all these years later, that he has a photograph of the two of us together in that race on the wall of his cloakroom at home, which reminds him of that, and we often have a bit of a laugh about it, and because it was such a memorable race for the obvious reasons.
There was a kind of surreal feeling around the circuit as people emptied out. This place that had been really buzzing, suddenly everybody was leaving, and we had the party that night, and that was a good party.
There was one quote that I remember Robert saying after the race, when somebody said, "Robert, why didn't you stop when the black flag was shown?" And Robert said, if they wanted to stop me, they would have had to have lain down in the road in front of me.